It's Bye-Mageddon with 4 teams on bye in Major League Rugby's round 11. It's going to be a tough week to navigate for Fantasy MLR managers, but the Fantasy Ruckers are here to help, including some top waiver wire advice. And of course, we'll look back at the week that was in round 10 and discuss the crazy incident that everyone's talking about in one of this past weekend's matches. The Fantasy Ruckers Show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode number 63 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Thank you so much to our Fantasy Ruckers League members, our community members, and everyone else tagging along on this journey of trying to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. And like you heard at the top of the show, Bye-Mageddon is here. 4 teams on bye heading into round 11. It's going to be a tough one for fantasy managers to navigate. That is why the Fantasy Ruckers Show is here, to give all our fantasy league members a little bit of advice heading into what is going to be a tough week. And you see Matt here with me on the show, as always, rocking the sunglasses, has the number 1 ribbon on. It is good times rolling there for the Ruck and Roll team.
Look, I had to take the sunglasses off. I was getting way too close to the sun there with how high up in the standings I am. But I'll take the sunglasses off for the show. I put the number 1 ribbon back on because I don't know what's happening, but looks like I'm unstoppable, right?
No kidding. And talk about a drastic difference from this point last year. I mean, it's incredible. You must be feeling on top of the moon right now. It looks like you're on top of the moon. I mean, if you're watching on the YouTube portion of the podcast, the background there, it looks like you're in space, man.
I am on top of the moon. I don't know where everybody else is because they're sitting way down in the standings in second place down on Earth. So, yeah, I mean, I tried being humble, Ryan. I tried that with 3
You
episodes
did try
ago.
that.
I tried. It couldn't bring me down. I'm still up here. I don't know what to do. Somebody's got to try and burst this bubble because I just keep floating away.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you're winning, how many in a row here? You've won 3, 4, 5.
It's 7,
5,
Ryan, I think.
6, 7. 7 in a row. 8 in a row.
8 in a row.
8 in a row. You've won. I would understand why it's a little bit hard to be humble, but we'll get to it. We're going to have a Fantasy Ruckers League update, and we're going to break down all the latest happenings in the Fantasy Ruckers League, where people are, where all our league members are standing in here. Again, got a jam-packed episode in this one.
Yeah.
Going to get our league members prepared for Bye-Mageddon here. Again, 4 teams on bye this week, and of course, we're going to look back at round 10 and all the good matchups that we had there, and we had some pretty interesting news happening over the course of this weekend as well. Some videos going viral here about a little bit of an altercation, not between players, between a couple coaches.
Ryan,
this interesting.
This week had everything. I mean, you got the inertia of the sign and trade deadline, everything coming in. You get the crazy weekend of games, high scoring, some slaps, some punches. Some of those got thrown, and then you get the Fantasy Rucker League. That being a crazy week, first time for some people. I mean, getting some dubs,
Yeah, we're gonna allude to that.
I couldn't even believe it myself. But crazy week. It had everything. And now we're going into Bye-Mageddon. It just doesn't stop.
Yeah, it did have a little bit of everything. And again, we're going to break it all down. But first, of course, like we say every single episode, if you aren't already, make sure you're giving us a follow at the Fantasy Ruckers. All the handles there are up above there on the YouTube video of our screen. If you're listening on the podcast, all of that is in the description. Been having an absolute blast this season so far. Keep following us on this journey of trying to make fantasy rugby a reality. And again, those are all the avenues where you're going to find out whether or not fantasy rugby, fantasy MLR is going to be able to come to you in the near future, because that is something that we are still currently working very hard on to try to get it to more people. And if all that is enough for you, we do have a Discord channel as well, where you can interact with our community members, you can interact with us, you can interact with the Fantasy Ruckers crew, and have a little bit of fun. And it's been loud, keeping up to date. I mean, a whole bunch of news dropping there, a lot of conversation happening there, huge conversation over the news that we're going to get to about the altercation between a couple coaches there over the weekend. So again, a lot of fun over there. And as well, well, if you haven't already checked it out, where our fantasy league is taking place, thefantasyruckers.com. Even if you're not into fantasy, got a whole bunch of stats up there for you to follow along on your favorite players, how they're doing, how teams are doing. And if you are interested in fantasy MLR, of course, all of that is there from a fantasy points perspective. You can also check out the Fantasy Ruckers League and see how everyone is doing. All right, you ready to get into this? We got a busy episode, Matt. We got to get right to it.
Yeah, let's get into it. I mean, we got a lot to talk about, right?
All right, let's do it. Let's start getting into the news. And again, we've been alluding it here for the first 5 minutes of this show. Yeah, a little bit of an altercation here between two of the coaches happening in the Houston SaberCats and New York Ironworkers match. Houston SaberCats head coach Pote Uman getting in a little bit of an altercation with New York Ironworkers performance coach Ollie Richardson during a water break of the match. Now, there is kind of some speculation in regards of what led to the altercation. Dean Muir actually went onto I believe a South African Facebook group post or something like that to kind of clarify what was happening. There was some initial speculation that maybe it was because of a yellow card that was given out. Dean Muir squashed that, and there has been more reports coming out about how it had something to do with the coaches not being allowed to be in the huddle when it comes to that water break time. Obviously, New York Ironworkers performance coach took a little bit of the matters into his own hands and having a problem with maybe some of the coaching staff being a part of that water break there for the Houston SaberCats. But nonetheless, Pote Human yelling at Ollie Richardson, comes over, throws a slap. Ollie Richardson doesn't like that. He throws a punch and it gets heated. The if you call it, the benches kind of clear out there, using a baseball term. All the players come out on the field, holding them back. But yeah, what an altercation and what a shocking thing to see. Really took everyone by surprise and really went viral everywhere. I mean, it was all across social media, not even just on the MLR channels, but really on all the rugby channels across the world, really, about this thing happening between two coaches in the MLR.
And Ryan, if anything, this has taught us one thing, right? This has taught us the ultimate lesson that I've been trying to preach all season. And now we're finally seeing the consequence of this happening. Shut down the water breaks. This is what you're causing the MLR. This is what you're causing. The water breaks, right? They're causing stoppages in play. They're causing coaches to fight. You're seeing overhand slap being thrown by, I don't know what, he's got to be 50-something.
I think he's in the 60s, man.
In the 60-something. You're seeing punches getting thrown back. You're seeing CC Mahoney running on the field trying to stop his coach. This is what you caused, MLR, by bringing on these water breaks. Every 20th, every 60th minute, now we're going to be worried about a coach fight and a 60-year-old getting slapped or punched right in the face, and it's your fault.
Leave it to Matt Yee to spin this around and somehow turn it into a anti-water break conversation. But yeah, Pote Uman, 63 years old and getting a little bit frisky there in that altercation. I will say at the time of the recording of this podcast, Major League Rugby has come out with a statement saying that the league office is currently investigating the incident that took place between the two coaches in the matchup between New York and Houston this past weekend. Upon completion of the investigation, the league will take any necessary action in line with the competition and behavior regulations.
I've got an action they should take, Ryan. All right.
Do you? Okay. What do you think? What do you think?
And the water break.
Oh, okay. All right. That's enough of that. I get it. I think the viewers and listeners are abundantly clear your opinion there on the water break. But from your opinion, though, in terms of an actual play standpoint, what do you think needs to happen here? And it's pretty wild, man. I mean, if you saw this in any other league around the world, two coaches getting into it, it's a very North American thing, I must say.
It's unfortunate that it seems like, I think somebody said it, that it's unfortunate that the North American sports culture has kind of leaked its way into this beautiful game that we love watching. I'm sure after the fact they shook hands, they moved on with it, and that's the rugby game.
Yeah,
I'm sure they shared a beer, but I mean, to me, like they got essentially sent off, both of them. The favorite thing that I've always had about rugby is that coaches, you sit up in the booth, you're not really interacting with players other than miking down to the water guys. Mm-hmm. And you sit up in the booth and you let the players play. It's their time to take what you've taught them at training, put it on the pitch. And I think it's unfortunate this had to happen, and I don't know what Pote Human was doing down there on the field. But yeah, I mean, I don't think anything more should happen. What's the big deal of giving a coach and a performance guy a 2-game suspension? Like, they're still going to be at training. The coaches aren't really like fully making all the decisions anyways in games. I don't know what that would do or benefit anybody.
Sure. So I guess we'll see what the MLR decides to do with this. If I had to predict, I'm going to assume there is going to be some sort of suspension for these coaches coming down.
There should be a fine or something.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, yeah, sure. And to your point, I'm not too sure what that does. It's really just kind of just kind of cleanup duty after this. But I will say, there is a saying out there that say there's no such thing as bad publicity. And let me tell you, from a positive standpoint from this, of course, never want to see this. Don't like seeing, this type of antics happening on the field in spirit of the game. But nonetheless, though, this is probably going to be the most watched clip of any MLR clip or highlight, at least to the date. I mean, the amount that it was spreading on social media was insane. It was on their r/rugby union page. It was on pages that usually don't get a whole lot of MLR content.
But I mean, you look at it that way, but there's also the whole thing of, anybody who is maybe hesitant they've never watched MLR, they watch other leagues around the world and they go, oh, maybe I'll try. And then they see that and they're like, oh, it's just, it's a beer league. That's what it is. It's just a beer league because this is what you get. And sure. I don't know, maybe that works oppositely where people who are,
or they just love the craziness.
That too. That could happen.
The wild, wild west over here. I will say Vandy, our in-house kind of novice rugby fan. I wouldn't call him novice anymore because he is learning a whole bunch over the past 2 years that he's been watching this game. He says he doesn't care, man. It's great attention for the MLR. So I think he may fall into loving the whole craziness.
That guy just loves watching a scuffle. So
I will note, I do have some insider knowledge in terms of Ollie Richardson, the New York coach who was involved in the altercation here. So on the Road to Glory podcast, one of the co-hosts, Gavin Hickey, head coach for Navy Rugby right now. When he was playing overseas, I believe with either Leicester or Leinster, Ollie Richardson was a coach with him over there, and he knows that Ollie is a big time MMA guy. So when he landed that punch on Pote Human, it probably hurt, man, because it looked like he connected pretty good. Yeah, he had some.
Somebody made that comment and said, Ollie Richardson, chin down, punch. That looked like textbook MMA, and 63-year-olds. You can't be taking that stuff. You can't be taking them.
All right. Well, let's shift on here again. We're waiting at the time of this recording this podcast what the fallout is going to be from this whole thing. But again, just a really crazy, regardless of what standpoint you're on it, whether you're completely against it or whether or not you thought it was entertaining. I think for both of us, Matt, there was a little bit of both of that, and just a whole lot of shock value in terms of seeing that on a Fox Sports 2 game as well. We will see what the kind of the opinion of the league is about this and the consequences that are come with it. It should be interesting to see what they decide to do with that. All right, let's quickly shift on over here to some news before we catch up on a whole bunch of roster moves. A little bit of news happening here with the going to be, I guess, the future newest member of Major League Rugby in 2024, the Miami Sharks Rugby Club, who again will be joining next season, making a big time announcement in terms of who will lead the helm for their squad, and that is going to be Jose Pellicina as their new head coach. He comes obviously from Argentina. We know that the ownership team has those Argentinian ties. This is a guy that has experience coaching the men's under-20 Argentina's national team, and we'll see how he's going to be able to make that jump here to pro rugby with the Miami Sharks.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see the way that the Dallas Jackals and the Miami Sharks are going to be fighting for these Argentinian players. And I mean, speaking of Argentinian players, I mean, they've seemed to already name a big one, and I'm surprised Dallas Jackals didn't already get their hands on this.
Yeah, no kidding. They come out with a tweet yesterday saying, "Can you guess who our newest signing is?" And they lay down some hints. He's a scrum half. He's a current Puma. He played professionally in Australia and in France. And when you put all those things together, really, there's only one name that comes to mind. And for you, Matt, it had
to be Thomas Cubelli. Thomas Cabelli, that guy is borderline an Argentinian legend. I remember watching him play for the Pumas in all those years in the Tri Nations or Quad Nations Cup. Um, it's the Rugby Championship now. You always loved watching him play. Super experienced. He's going to be a great kind of face of the franchise type guy, and honestly, the perfect guy to name first because they're setting the tone. Hey, look, we're going to get big time Argentinian players. We're going to get big time South American players. Miami Sharks might come to this real hot.
Yeah, it should be interesting. Yeah, like you said, I think a great guy to start building your club around. It should be interesting. Now, there is no official announcement yet, but they are teasing it, at least at the time.
Well, they didn't make it hard, Ryan.
No kidding. Those hints were pretty easy there. All right. Now let's go into some more signings and talk about and catch up kind of some of the flurry of moves that happened over the course of the past week.
This is the inertia.
Yeah, we mentioned it last episode about how it was the sign and trade deadline for this league, and kind of we were going to see a fallout in terms of that of a lot of signings coming through after that. So we're just going to go here and run through it. I'm going to just list out all these signings, Matt, and then you let me know in terms of fantasy impact who here you're really having an eye on. Okay, so we start off obviously the trade last week. Salary cap considerations going to Utah. Rugby Atlanta receiving the service rights to Niles Sanders. That should be interesting. I know that Rugby Atlanta has been kind of flip-flopping between nines over the course of the season. Do we see Niles Sanders really establish himself as the starting nine? If he does, he may be a guy that could help you out towards the tail end of the season. I'm just not sure though, because it seems like it's been a carousel with that Rugby Atlanta squad.
Yeah, he hasn't played for Utah yet, which was surprising, first of all, because he was kind of a staple of their team last year.
Yeah.
But I've liked Ryan Reese for Rugby Atlanta, so we'll see how that plays out.
Okay. Chicago signing Matai Luda at the winger position. That's pretty big. Cam Dodson. Lauda. Cam Dodson going to Chicago as well. Big pickup there. Sayao Naya, a Utah scrum half, getting signed there. So maybe there was a little bit of some connecting the dots there. They need to make a little bit of room at the scrum half position for him. We also have Tyler Wong, front rower, signing with the Toronto Arrows. Stephen Lombard going to Chicago Hounds as well. Dallas Jackals announcing not Cabelli, Thomas Kubia.
Yes,
Argentinian 25-year-old center. He signs with the Dallas Jackals. So keep.
I think with this signing, the Jackals could possibly have a Thomas center combination. It's the double T's.
And you never know. You always have to bank on that chemistry there in the center positions.
Yeah.
And then also a big shout out to friend of the show, Mike Smith. After having a little stint there, taking a little break to go use that big brain of his to go tackle his medical school dreams.
Yeah.
He's coming back, re-signing with the San Diego Legion.
Yeah, San Diego Legion has had some back row injury struggles. I believe Blair Cowan was out, and Poitevin, we haven't seen him in the lineup, at least last week, I don't think. I could be wrong. I don't remember seeing him in the lineup. Poitevin wasn't in the lineup. We had Tom Franklin at 6, which, that's not his natural position. Mike Smith will live right at home in that back row, and he'll put up tackles. We know Mike Smith. He'll put up tackles, and we love seeing tackles in this league, and now that we have the tackle score.
Yeah, should be interesting there. And again, he's a guy that is definitely available in our league, and we'll get to more of this in the waiver wire segment. But again, you know how important it is to have consistent point performers in fantasy MLR, and tackles is a big proponent of that. Michael Smith was a electric when it came to that stat column. So he may be a guy that may help you in a playoff push here towards the tail end of this fantasy MLR season. And then again, we got to talk about these two big names. So Ruben De Haas, rumors is that he will be returning, or he will be coming to the MLR. Per Brian Ray, it's to the SaberCats. Haven't seen an official announcement there as of yet. He just said, at least according to Rugby America's News, that he was going to be making some sort of signing with a playoff contender. SaberCats would fit in that. And then the big one here, Bodine Waka. He's going to be returning to the New England Free Jacks, finishing up his contract with his Japanese team overseas with Kobelco. I believe is how you
Yep.
pronounce it.
Go
He'll
Steelers.
be returning to the New England Free Jacks to help them with their playoff push towards the tail ends of this season.
Yeah, and this wasn't just announced by Brian Ray. He also confirmed it on his social media as well that he's coming back. It'll be interesting to see when he's back. He'll obviously have a fantasy impact. He had a quote saying, "Oh, he had to earn his way back into the 15," but the guy just made millions of dollars overseas. I think he's got his way back into the 15 fairly firm.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, we're going to break down and have more of a chat about kind of the waiver wire implications of some of these guys. We mentioned Michael Smith. Of course, Bodine Walker is going to be a top name on there. Ruben DeHaas, I'm sure, will be a big-time name there as well, and we'll mention some other ones. But in terms of fantasy impact, out of all the guys that I've listed there, obviously we've seen some of these guys already make an appearance this past weekend, so you kind of have a little bit of a baseline to go off of. But who are you really looking at in terms of guys that could be making a fantasy impact here as we approach the tail end of the Fantasy MLR season?
I mean, it's a tough one, and I'm going to leave Bodine Walker and Ruben DeHaas kind of out of it because those are, ones that are going to be coming on in these times, and they're just too obvious, right? I can't go with the obvious ones for people. I mean, for me, honestly, I look at that Thomas could be a signing. I mean, you look at, and we'll get into this, but you look at the Dallas Jackals last week and the way that their offense looks, and you've seen them the past multiple weeks as well. I think we're seeing a team that's on the up and an offense that you can start trusting. And we saw that the use of their centers last week, and we'll get to it, but they clearly are an offense that you can start trusting now.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So again, we'll mention more about some of these guys in the waiver wire segment and talk about their fantasy implication in terms of what they can do for a fantasy MLR team. And it should be interesting because I do think some of these names will appear on teams that are really going to make a big time push here in a playoff run and potentially get their name here behind me if you're watching on the YouTube video on the Fantasy Ruckers Championship jersey that is at stake here for the 2024 season. And now speaking of a playoff push, man, our league continues to get more and more interesting when it comes to how tight this league has been, the competitiveness between our league members, and just how everything has been shaken out, and there's been no shortage of that coming out of round 10. So I guess it's time here, Matt, to give a little bit of an update here to all the people about the Fantasy Ruckers League.
Oh, they already know who's sitting up top.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All right, hear ye, hear ye. Here is Commissioner Yee with a Fantasy Ruckers League update. I feel like we can skim over this one. It's getting a little bit tiresome, but again, Matt, you heard it at the top of the show, all of our listeners and viewers, that
What do you mean? You don't name my name in last place last year, and now you won't name my name in first place this year? What's going on here?
You've had your time. You've had 8 weeks of your time. But yes, Ruck and Roll right now at the top of the league.
Hey, Ryan, how many points for I got?
We'll get into it, but it's a pretty big sizable number.
Who else has got that?
And not even close. And I will say that your point total this past week definitely helped with that. So let's start there. Let's start with the matches that we had this past week. Some interesting ones, some upsets here, shaking up the rankings a little bit. So we'll start off with you, Matt. I mean, you took care of business taking on James Dealey's MLR Stats team. Only team to crack triple digits this week. 107.9 points to 88.7. Pretty impressive stuff.
Hey, you want to hear something crazy? Duncan Matthews and Nate Oxberger weren't even my lineup.
That is very frightening. That is very frightening. For those of you who may have not been following along fantasy-wise this season so far, Nate Oxberger is the heading into round 10 was the #1 fantasy MLR player on the season so far, and he was on the bench this past week. Did make an appearance though, I believe.
He played like 60 minutes. I mean, yeah. I think. I forget who got hurt, but he played 6. He ended up playing like 60 minutes. So
he knew he had to make some sort of impact for you.
Even
if it's on your bench, he still wanted to make an impact. Moving on here, we don't have Vandy here on today's show, but man, he keeps on rolling, and he racks up now 3 wins in a row for
this guy skipping our show to drink beers, Ryan.
89.8 fantasy points to Dankus Anchor's 82.4. And we'll get into the standings here in the Fantasy Ruckers League. But with the way that the results shook out in round 10 from a fantasy matchup perspective, he's right in the playoff hunt. He's in a playoff spot right now. And if you would have said that 4 or 5 weeks ago when he was sitting at the bottom, tied with MLR All Access, you would have been laughing. But look, he's making a push here, which is pretty interesting stuff. And speaking of MLR All Access, gotta mention it. First franchise win in their fantasy history. They take down Stephen Lowen and the Feral Hippies. That one has got to hurt for Stephen. But MLR All Access taking it 85.2 to 75.4. Had some big time players there stepping up for him. Players like Conrado Rura, who stepped up. He really put the trust in Fabian Goodall, the Toronto Arrows, who stepped up against the Seattle Seawolves, which is completely against the fantasy advice we were going into round 10. But nonetheless, I guess you got to risk it for the biscuit. Sam Gala has been performing for him, finally pulls through for him. So MLR All Access, they get away with their very first win of the season, albeit 10 weeks into the season. They may not really have a chance here to be making a push into playoffs. I think mathematically they are technically out of the playoff hunt.
Hey, better late than never.
4 weeks remaining in the season, but I don't think they would have liked to see a goose egg there for much longer here going forward in this fantasy MLR season. Eagles overseas taking on Rugby Morning. Bill Baker beating his buddy there on the happy hour show that they do co-host every Thursday. 96.7 to 78.1, so not really that close at all. I'm sure Bill Baker is going to have something to say to him on this week's happy hour show there, Eagles overseas happy hour show. And then lastly, this one helps for you, Matt. Rugby Wrap Up takes down Lads on Tour, who has somewhat of a disappointing showing this week. He was the one that was really chasing your coattails there when it came to being in that second place spot and getting that bye into the Fantasy MLR playoffs. He falls to Rugby Wrap Up 71.6 to 61.6.
Can't take the heat.
And take the heat. All right. Now, how this all shakes up now, it has made it interesting. Obviously, Rock and Roll at the top of the standings with a 9-1 record, 916.5 total fantasy points for, which is incredible. The next team has 802.8, so 115 points more than any other team in the Fantasy Ruckers League, which is ridiculous. Now, I will preface it by saying you do have one of the lowest points against.
Well, sucks that people suck then.
All right. Coming in at second, third, and fourth spot, Rugby Morning, Lads on Tour, MLR Stats, all tied with the 6-4 record. The differential and the decider being the total fantasy points for that gap. One is interesting. Get the heck out of here. I will say what makes it interesting is that hunt for that second spot. Again, the top two teams get a first round bye into the Fantasy MLR playoffs. That race is getting very, very interesting. And then coming down, Rugby Wrap Up, the Rucking Goat in that fifth, sixth spot.
Look at him go. Look at our boy 5 go, record. Ryan.
Incredible. Right in the playoff hunt, currently sitting in the playoff spot. He's going to have to keep the good times going because right behind him is Feral Hippies, Dankus Anchors, Eagles overseas in the 7, 8, 9 spot at a 4-6 record. So they're right there on the coattails as well. And again, we have MLR All Access at the end there. But they do have their first victory now, 1-9 on the season.
They did it, Ryan. They finally did it. We love to see it. And we love to see Vandy in that playoff spot, hoping he can keep on going.
Pretty good stuff. All right. You want to start talking about some of these games that led to these matchup performances?
Yeah, let's get into it.
All right, let's get into some of these matches. Again, had a very exciting weekend of rugby. I thought there were a lot of interesting performances, some shocking ones, some not so shocking ones. But we'll start off here by the first matchup of the week. Old Glory DC taking on the Utah Warriors at home. I had Utah going into this one, but man, Old Glory DC is impressing. And now with back-to-back wins, really building the momentum heading into their bye week. They looked good. And now they sit. We talk about how close our Fantasy Ruckers League standings are. I mean, the Major League Rugby standings are even closer. Now, Old Glory DC finds themselves, despite struggling there early in the season, in second place in the East.
I don't even know what to say about the East, Ryan. The East is just New England Free Jacks and then nobody over 500. It makes absolutely no sense to me, but they just seem to be beating up on each other, and they can't figure out who's going to be the second place team. So looks good for my NOLA Gold boys and on my prediction. But yeah, Old Glory DC team. I was surprised. I think both of us went for Utah, Ryan, because we didn't have much faith in them. But I mean, Old Glory DC comes out strong, gets a huge win for the squad, keeps them kind of in the running for that, obviously in second place. So you love to see it. Yeah, it was an interesting one for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it was a different way that this Old Glory DC team kind of won. Usually, they're not the team that really comes out the gate, but they were up 14-0 really, really quick here. And then, Utah kind of making that push back, but they were able to respond. Really played well defensively. So yeah, I mean, kudos to Old Glory DC for starting to really build that momentum after a tough start to the season. Let's talk about some individual players on this one. I know Vandy is going to be a little bit salty. Maybe that's why he didn't show up on the show here with Utah, taking that tough win because they've been.
San
You could
Diego
argue.
won, no?
You could argue one of the. You can argue one of the hottest teams in the league right now, Utah Warriors. They just weren't able to get that done and have some of those big breaks that they typically have during those games. But let's talk about Old Glory DC players first. I want to mention William Talatina first because this guy for the past 3 weeks has been absolutely killing it. 3 straight weeks in a row with a try scored. He scored 5 out of the past 6 weeks that he's played. In this past game against Utah, 53 meters gained, scores a try, and adds 12 tackles as well, plus a try assist, 16.4 total fantasy points. This guy's impressing so far, and you add to that as well, 5 of the 7 matches that he's played in, double-digit fantasy points as well. Talatina is being a guy that is being a fantasy asset so far that you really didn't think so in parts of the season.
Yeah, a cheeky little grubber try assist to Penny Lasaka. I mean, he looked real good out there. I think this is a guy that, we didn't expect to be a catalyst for that Old Glory DC offense, but I mean, he's clearly a big part of them winning or losing or having, he's a big part of their offense essentially. And that clearly shows with how many tries. I mean, was that 4 tries in the last 3 games? It's pretty impressive.
Yep. Absolutely. And then you mentioned him, Penny Lasaka. He did business as well in this one. 16.7 total fantasy points, 67 meters gained, a try with 15 tackles as well. 15 tackles from a back 3 player. That's insane. Pretty impressive stuff by him. And then the last player that I will want to mention too, and I feel like we mention him every single week. Nothing crazy. Out of this world in terms of a fantasy performance wise by this player, but he's just a guy that's been consistent throughout this season so far, and he's coming off of a 20-point performance. Jamison Fa'anana Schultz, once again, I mean, the 15 tackle performance, 72 meters gained, just doesn't find the try zone in this one, which really kind of diminishes points, but 11.7 fantasy points, scoring double-digit fantasy points in 6 straight weeks. Jama is being is as consistent as it gets for fantasy.
You know what? I got to bring up somebody else as well, is Graydon Bowd. I mean,
sure.
He comes in, Tito Diaz-Bonilla coming off the bench. He's in that starting position. That's pretty big shoes to fill. And the guy comes in, not just playing, but attacking the line. He had a big break there as well that led to, a nice, led to Old Glory DC being put on the front foot. So he's impressed for me in the past 2 games. He's shown 11.8 fantasy points, 15 fantasy points. Yes, he's been the kicker as well for them, but regardless, he's impressed for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you talk about big shoes to fill. I mean, obviously there was so much hype with Tito Diaz-Bonilla heading this season, but I mean, talk about back-to-back wins for this Old Glory team. Graydon Bowd has been a instrumental part of that for this squad. Let's shift over to the Utah Warriors side. A guy that I want to mention, Tuvera Vuga-Koto. I mean,
how many times have I told people?
Right?
I've been telling them for 3 weeks. I didn't even pick him up. I've been leaving him there for you to pick up, and nobody's picking him up. You want me to take him? Is that what you want? Jeez.
I mean, he has been struggling from a fantasy point performance towards so far this season. I mean, he had that red card incident in round 5, which really put a damper on his fantasy point total. But from a front row point production standpoint, I mean, 9.7 in round 8. 5.6 in round 9, so kind of down, but then comes out with the 17.9 point performance in round 10.
I told
try 81 meters gained, try assist, 6 tackles. Not sure if he's going to be able to repeat a performance like this, but definitely a big time performance in round 10.
Yeah, I mean, look, I told the people, you guys keep going to say he can't repeat the performance, and he comes out and puts another great performance in. So, look, I'll tell you now, I'll tell you again, this is a guy to pick up.
All right. And then next, Mika Kruse. He's been doing pretty well so
Of
far.
course.
Has scored 5 tries in the past 6 games. Has scored a try in 5 of the matches and out of the 6 in every single one. So it's not like he's been getting like a bulk total in one of them. It's been a
Yeah.
pretty consistent play by him so far. 79 meters gained in this round 10 matchup against Old Glory DC. Adds the try, 2 tackles, 13.5 fantasy point performance. Mika Kruse is another one that's pretty impactful when it comes to a fantasy lens.
And we obviously can't talk about the Utah Warriors without talking about Lance Williams.
Yep.
I mean, look, he didn't have, the meters gained. He got 42 meters gained, but he found himself in the right position to score 2 tries. Anytime you find yourself in the right position to do that, you're going to have a good week, and that's what he did. Another guy I want to bring up, Brian, is Cliven Loudser. I mean, he's been put in that 15 position in the past 2 weeks, and he's looked good. I mean, 120 meters gained this week is just great to see. And, on the flip side, maybe probably a big reason that Utah lost is that Joel Hodgson performance. You get the yellow. Joel Hodgson is a guy that really drives him around pitch. If he's off for 10 minutes, that's 10 minutes where you're a little bit in shambles there.
Yeah. 17.9 points for Lance Williams there. And then for Cliven Laubser, just going to pull up his numbers here as well.
14.8.
14.8 point fantasy performance, 120 meters gained, 6 tackles. Didn't even need a try this past weekend.
No.
Obviously, Lance Williams getting that double try performance there against Old Glory DC. All right, let's shift on over to the next matchup of the weekend there. The New England Free Jacks taking on Rugby Atlanta. It was close for a while. Maybe it looked like Rugby Atlanta could have pulled one out of the bag, but nonetheless.
They were leading. They were leading and going into the second half.
But nonetheless, New England Free Jacks taking this one 23-13. And again, this is one that you kind of look at and really there's a handful of fantasy point performers here. But that low scoring point total, especially from the Rugby Atlanta side of things, really not seeing many of those guys. But there are some guys here that we need to do point out.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's tough. I want to bring this guy up because Vandy loves this guy. And it's no surprise the fact that Vandy has been going on a winning streak ever since he's been back in the lineup.
It is true.
And you look at LaRue Milena, this guy, man, the one try that he scored, you give him the ball, and he just kind of says, all right, try to take me down. You can try your best. I think there must have been, I was counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 guys trying to take him down. And he just said, okay, the try line's right there. You can try and stop me. And he just kept going. So, I mean, he's a guy that's been a huge little ad for New England Free Jacks, and they're not done adding players. So it's going to be crazy to see them continue to go.
Yeah, talking about LaRue Milan, I mean, he has had double-digit fantasy point performances ever since he returned to the New England Free Jacks lineup. Doesn't even have to be a start. Round 8, coming off the bench, scoring a try. Round 9, starting, 2 tries. Now in round 10 against Rugby Atlanta, 1 try, 76 meters gained, 5 tackles, 14.6 total fantasy point performance. He is going to be a guy that is going to be pivotal for Vandy's playoff run here, or at least push for a playoff berth as we get to the tail end with 4 weeks remaining in our regular season of the Fantasy Ruckers League. Another guy I want to mention, obviously, on the New England Free Jacks side of things, Paula Balakena. He was a guy that was obviously a big pickup at the beginning of the season, has started basically almost every single match up until this point outside of a couple. 15.2 fantasy point performance, 87 meters gained, another try. He's now scored in 3 straight games, has 7 tries in the past 6 matches. I think that's correct that he's played, and then adding 5 tackles in this past week. I mean, he's had double-digit point performances in 6 of the 8 matches that he's played.
I got a text from the old lads on tour, and he texted me going, "What was I thinking dropping Paul Balakena after the first week?" I said, "I don't know what you were thinking, man, because look at him." And he's a guy we literally talk about every week. He always finds a way to make an impact. I don't even know what else to say anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I do want to mention Spencer Jones stepping into the fullback role.
Yeah, that's 3 good weeks in a row.
Exactly. 12.7 fantasy point performance, 1 try, 74 meters gained, double digits in back-to-back weeks. So pretty solid from him.
Now, I'll throw up Ryan Conradi, 13.8 points. I mean, 18 tackles, and you got the 84 meters gained. He looked great. He always looks great. Yeah, I mean, New England Free Jacks found a way to have a lot of guys to put up fantasy points, and Rugby Atlanta maybe not so much.
Yeah, and then when you go down this Rugby Atlanta list, A little bit tough. You do see some guys with a lot of tackle numbers, but you're not going to necessarily see any big time performances from that. You're just going to see some consistent stuff. I mean, you look at Johan Mumsen,
Yeah.
9.4 points off of a 19 tackle point performance. He was the highest for this Rugby Atlanta squad. Obviously, had some try scores here and there. Alex Mon scoring a try, Ruida Biddle scoring a try.
Yeah.
But really, out of this Rugby Atlanta team, no one really popped off the page when it came to a fantasy perspective.
Gotta agree.
All right, let's shift on over now to the next matchup. On the Saturday, Dallas Jackals taking on
What
the
a
San Diego
wild
Legion
game.
at home. This is what you'd like to see from a fantasy point
I mean,
performance perspective.
not even this. This is what you love to see from Dallas, Ryan. I mean,
Sure.
you know, we've been wanting to see this Dallas team kind of put on this show, and I mean, what a way to do it, to really take it to one of the top teams in the West. And they really just started scoring points. Their offense looked good. Thomas Milanos, we'll talk about him. He obviously looked really good. But you're starting to love to see this Dallas Jackals team do well. And it's just great to watch.
Absolutely. But yeah, let's break it down. For obviously big time win by San Diego, 47-38. When you see that number of points being scored, I mean, fantasy managers are licking their chops because you just know that there's going to be so many different point performers in this one. So let's start off with the Dallas Jackals side of things. I mean, you had, how many tries here? 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 different 6 tries being scored in this match by the Dallas Jackals by 5 different players. So lots of fantasy points to go around. The biggest one for me, I think, Conrad Aurora. Huge a part of why MLR All Access was able to get their win, their first win this past week. 17.6 fantasy points, 87 meters gained, a try assist, 8 tackles. Impressive stuff by the back rower.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to talk about him, we ought to talk. I already brought him up. Thomas, one of the T's that they've got on their team now. Thomas Milanos. I mean, just a ridiculous 2 tries, 84 meters gained. The guy is absolutely rolling. So, he looked really good out there. But I got to bring up, I don't even remember who it was, Ryan, but one of the wingers, it's either Marcus Maroney or Campbell Johnstone. I don't even remember. Absolutely Randy Mossing on the crossfield kick on one of the tries. Just ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous.
That would, I believe, be Marcus Maroney there. He was the lone back threer that did score the try. And he did have a big time performance. I mean, the try, 82 meters gained, 5 tackles there. Maroney racking up 18.7 total fantasy points, 82 meters gained, a try, 5 tackles. Impressive stuff. I do want to then also mention Thomas Milanos. Looked pretty good. You did just bring up 2 tries, 84 meters gained, pretty crazy stuff. 22.1 fantasy points there. And then looking down this list, good to see Boyson find the try line. Added 17 tackles as well.
He doesn't need it. Doesn't need it to find the try line. I mean, he can if he wants. I'd love to see it, but he doesn't need to. The guy just racks up tackles and just gets a bunch of points for everybody.
13.3. 13.3 fantasy points. All right, shifting over to San Diego now. I think the biggest player that we need to talk about in this one is Tian Lutz, who was able to get 2 tries, 113 meters gained, and 15 tackles, which amounted to a big time performance of 26.3 total fantasy points. You're loving seeing Tian Lutz do that on the San Diego Legion.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you give Nanu the week off. They have a little bit of a different lineup coming into this week. The guy steps into the 12 jersey, grabs it by the throat and just kills it. So you love to see it. Unfortunately, probably not a guy that you can continue to see in that lineup just because of the quality of their centers. But you never know. I mean, that performance is what puts you on the map. All you need is one performance, and you can kind of take off and be a staple of that starting lineup.
Yeah. Another big performer, Tavita Taimalau, back rower for San Diego, 16.1 total fantasy points, 65 meters gained, a try, and 12 tackles. That's another one that you do like to see.
Yep, I love to see that. I just dropped him, but I didn't need him, so that's fine. So that's fine. Yeah, And then another guy. I mean, the guy who he wasn't. The fantasy manager probably missed him last week. Thomas Aoaki. coming back with 16.3 fantasy points. Obviously puts a try up because that's just what he does, and 70 meters gained and a try assist. So you love to see it from him. He's a guy that really has got into form this year. A guy I expected a lot of after he got signed last year, but has really showed his stuff this year.
And just to appease to you, Matt, for our Nate Augsburger watch, who continues to be the #1 fantasy MLR player
What up?
this season, coming off the bench for the first time this year, still racks up 8.6 fantasy points with 76 meters gained in 69 minutes. So, I mean, even when he's
Nice.
not in the lineup, starting lineup, I should say, he's still making somewhat of a fantasy contribution, which is, I guess, just the telltale sign of how his fantasy season is going so far. All right, now let's shift over to the Sunday matchups. Nola Gold taking on the Chicago Hounds to open up the afternoon in Chicago. Nola coming away with a much needed win, 37-24 over the Hounds.
I mean, Nola Gold came out hot. They came out real hot. I think they were up like 24-0 at one point. And I was like, all right, well, this is it for the Chicago Hounds. And you know, credit to the Chicago Hounds in those silky clean Bulls jerseys. They came back in the second half, really showed that they didn't want to quit. But look, it just wasn't enough against the Nola Gold that's going to win the championship.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about some performers on this one, we'll start with the Chicago Hounds. Julian Dominguez, I mean, continually is that
He finds his way
time...
back after injury, and it was a good game back for him.
Yeah, 11.1 fantasy points, nothing too crazy, but no try scored for him. And you see a triple-digit meters gain, 105 meters and 2 tackles. That is stuff you do like to see. And then I want to also add a 18 tackle performance by Luke White with 80 meters gained, which surmounted to a total of 14.4 fantasy points for him. So just kind of a look into what tackles can bring to the table there. But again, just 3 different try scorers for the Chicago Hounds team, and really not big time play tries. So not really any other huge fantasy performances, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, and we also got to talk about Cam Dodson, the team of the week MLR 15 guy, the new signee who we'll talk about. You know, is going to be maybe a big waiver wire pickup, but he had a great performance, a big game for him. And I mean, you love to see those guys who just got signed get put right into the lineup and be able to immediately make an impact.
Absolutely. All right. Shifting over to the Nola Gold side of things. I mean, how do we not talk about the Nola Gold without talking about JP Duplessis, which is a guy that has been carrying you towards this crazy season that you've been having. Talk about bouncing back from a down week, his lowest week point performance in round 9 that he's seen all season long, only 2.3 last week. Comes out and follows it up with a 27.1 total fantasy point performance, 145 meters gained, 12 tackles, 1 try in 82 minutes played, plus 2 breakdown steals. I mean, JP Duplessis is once again back in that column of why he's one of the best centers in the league.
This guy, his footwork and the way that he's able to break the line, the way he always gets his head stuck in the ruck, just provides you with endless joy of watching him rack up points every minute of the match for you.
Yeah. No, it's incredible how you can around this guy. I will mention also Luke Campbell, because again, scrum halves are not really a player that a position that really is able to rack up a total amount of points. But when a scrum half is able to rack up 14.9 fantasy points like he did this past week with 50 meters gained, 8 tackles, a try assist, and a try, you cannot mention Luke Campbell.
I thought this is kind of what we've been waiting for him, and the way that he needs to play in order to not only help him get fantasy points, but also help the Nola Golds continue to win. And he's going to be a big catalyst for that if he continues to play like he did on the weekend.
Absolutely. All right, let's shift on over now to the next matchup of Sunday. The New York Ironworkers taking on the Houston Sabercats at home, falling short by a try in a big-time win for the Houston Sabercats. Obviously, a lot of standing implication there for how the Eastern Conference is shaking up with New York once again dropping another match, but also some big-time fantasy performances in this one too.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great match to watch. And I mean, you got the little antics going on midway. I wonder how many points. Yeah, I wonder how many points Ollie Richardson and Pote Human got in our fantasy league. I'm sure CeCe Mahoney got some extra points for stopping the fight. I wish those were stats in our league, but another high scoring one. Unfortunately, Rugby New York just rough go.
Yeah. Fantasy point performance wise, I mean, a lot of tries coming off the bench for this New York Ironworkers team, so not really anything
Yeah.
of note there. Nick Feeks and Brooklyn Hardiker scoring tries for them. But looking at some of the players that are in that starting lineup who were able to score, Connor McManus, good to see him. I mean, we talk about Luke Campbell and talk about how we don't really see that point performance from scrum half positions necessarily, but 13.2
Yeah.
points, adequate stuff, 76 meters gained, a try, and 2 tackles.
Yeah, I'm sure a
I
lot of that came from that one try, but yeah, it's
Yeah,
I mean,
of
anytime
course.
this comeback can get a try, you love to see it.
Andrew Coe, friend of the show, also
Of
racking in
course.
a try there as well. He's been pretty good over the course of these past few games, despite the lulls that the New York Ironworkers has had. I mean, you're talking about back-to-back 20-point performances in round 8 and round 9, and then follows that up here in round 10 against the Houston SaberCats with a 14-point total fantasy point performance, 67 meters gained, and a try scored.
I mean,
So
this
he
is
continues.
yeah, this is just a continuation of last year, continuing to score tries, and a guy that we got to talk about if we're talking about, big part of that New York offense, Tay Walden. I mean,
Yep.
he has shown in the past 4 or 5 weeks of how potent he can be and how effective he can be in that offense. And I mean, he comes out 104 meters gained, 14 tackles, doesn't even need a try, racks up 15.1 fantasy points. That's what you love to see out of him, and that's what you expect out of him, frankly.
Absolutely. And now on the Houston SaberCats side, the biggest point performer here for the SaberCats, we got to talk about
Literally,
Christian
yeah,
Dyer.
yeah.
Christian Dyer, impressive stuff. 19.4 fantasy points, 100 meters gained, a try in 85 minutes played, plus 13 tackles. This is a guy that's had an up and down season, hasn't really done much in the round 7, 8, and 9. His last double-digit performance coming in round 6, but good to see him come back into the fantasy significant column here in round 10.
Yeah, I mean, there's three guys that we always talk about every week for this Houston SaberCats team. Christian Dyer, Davey Coates, Dave, we can't go. You
Yep.
talk about the Houston SaberCats without talking about Davey Coates with 66 meters gained, a try, 12 tackles. I mean, one of the rare tens that seems to always be scoring every game. I mean, he's got what, 4, 5, 6 tries in the last 4 games or 5 games. That's you don't see that often at 10, and he's money off the boot. So you
Yeah.
love to have that. He's probably one of the tens of the season, frankly.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, he's had more than 3 conversion kicks in the past 5
yeah,
straight matches. He's locked in a penalty in 2 of the past 3, and that kicking effectiveness really attributing to his point totals. This past week, 20.2 fantasy points with that try and 66 meters gained, and now has gone 5 straight weeks with double-digit point performances. 2 of those in the 20-point threshold, which is pretty impressive stuff.
yeah. And the next guy that we always talk about on this Houston offense is Dom McKenna. I
Yep.
mean, the guy continues to be a lethal part of this Houston offense. 15.5 fantasy points, 77 meters gained. Had that, he really created that try assist for Veroneki Tico Solomone.
Nice.
Yeah, thanks. And 11 tackles. I mean, he's always going to be a potent part of that offense, and he loves to contribute on the fantasy side too.
Yeah, and I do want to mention, I mean, it's nothing crazy impressive, but Dean Muir, I mean, finding the try zone once again off of a set piece try, 7.1 fantasy points, so nothing crazy. I don't think he's yet reaching to the draft value of where he was picked in our fantasy
Yeah.
MLR draft as the top front rower. But I mean, what front rowers really were you looking at that position? I mean, we do have some surprises this season. I think of Sama Malolo as one of those
Yeah.
guys being on San Diego, but really they're far and few in between. But to see him score another try, now I've scoring in 4 of the 5 appearances that he's had this season. I mean, he is taking advantage of that, and he is at least finding the try zone, which is keeping him somewhat fantasy relevant. All right, let's shift over to the last matchup. An interesting one here to wrap up the week. The Seattle Seawolves going north of the border to take on the Toronto Arrows, and it looked like for a little bit there that the Toronto Arrows were going to shock the league, leading at half, but the Seattle Seawolves in the end coming through with it and ending up taking this one 36-27.
I mean, look, Toronto Arrows coming off a record loss. You don't think they're going to do too much to the Seattle Seawolves, who are, a lethal team as we know it. But they come out strong and they look good. And it was interesting to see, and it was surprising to see. But you love to see an Arrows team fight like that at home. I'm just glad that the fans there didn't have to sit through another barn burner.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's tough to beat that Seattle Seawolves team, but the Toronto Arrows definitely made it interesting.
And I think the only guy that I really need to mention on this Toronto Arrows side from a fantasy perspective is Ross Brody, because he was really
Yeah.
the one that was the sole point output for this team and keeping the squad in it. I mean
Yeah.
that snipe obviously was huge, and then you have that grubber kick, or that the up and under kick that he was able to take advantage of. 22.9 fantasy points, 2 tries, 94 meters gained, 10 tackles. I mean, he was the performer for this Toronto
I
Arrows
think
team.
it's interesting these past 5 weeks. I think like 5 weeks ago, we were talking about how he's been kind of a letdown on the
Yeah.
season in the past 5 weeks. I guess he heard us. Maybe somebody told him. And he's kind of come out to play. And, it's been interesting to see the way that he's actually been able to show up offensively the threat that he was last year, and kind of that high value player last year because of his offensive and sniping ability from that 9 position.
Right.
We're seeing that along with support lines as well.
And sorry, I'll clarify. It was the one snipe on that try there on the outside with the kick, and then obviously finding that open space when Mitch Eady, I believe, was able to pick and go.
Yeah.
And then
Which
get
he
that
does
top pass
classic.
and use his speed to get the try zone. All right, let's shift on over to Seattle, because that's where a majority of the fantasy points were coming from. I think the guy that we have to mention, I know you love talking about him, Matt, Reichert Hadding. I mean, he's gone the 3 past weeks without scoring a try. He was a guy that we knew is just a try machine and finding that end zone, and he's able to get back in the column, scoring 2 tries in this one, making up for maybe the lack of try scoring ability over the past few weeks. 22.8 point performance for the guy that was drafted as the highest forward in our Fantasy Ruckers League.
I mean, 3 weeks, maybe the supplier was on vacation.
Oh my God.
He couldn't get the goods, and now he's got it back. He comes out with a big game, 2 tries, 87 meters gained. Of course, he had to make up for the 3 weeks that, he had to save his butt.
Absolutely. All right. And let's talk about another guy, Dan Creel. I mean, Dan Creel has been one of the low-key guys that just having such a
hardly
good
talked
fantasy
about him,
season.
Ryan.
Hardly ever. And we honestly should be talking about him more, because out
We
of
should.
the 9 weeks that he's played, he's only scored less than 10 points once. He's gone 4 straight weeks with double-digit point performances, has his best point performances in round 10 here, and doesn't even score a try. 18.7 fantasy points, 101 meters gained, 2 tries, 12 tackles. Dan Creel has been money this Fantasy MLR season and has been doing it under the radar.
Yeah, I mean, he's part of that center pairing that, is one of the deadliest in the MLR, and he's a big part of that. I mean, that guy is just a force for this offense, and honestly drives this offense forward most of the time.
Absolutely. Good to see Ronan Foley back in the lineup after obviously going through the injury early in the season.
What a surprise, right against his old team.
I know, right? That had to be done on purpose, right? There's no chance that they didn't not let him make an appearance against his old team. 1 try, 38 meters gained there. Nothing too crazy, but is cool to see him return to the lineup. Anyone else that you want to mention from the Seattle Seawolves squad? I mean, James Malcolm finding the try zone, Martin Iosefo finding the try zone. But really, it was Reichert Hadding and Dan Creel for me that really impressed me the most.
Yeah, I got to agree.
All right. Okay, busy round 10. Busy round 10. And I mean, we're not going to have so much of a busy round 11, because like we allude to, a Bye-Mageddon is coming here over the next 2 weeks. 4 teams on bye heading into round 11. And where this becomes important is because there are going to be a need for teams to have fantasy players on this waiver wire to stream some guys, fill some of those gaps in their lineups, because not everyone is going to be available. We got Rugby Atlanta on bye. We got the Chicago Hounds on bye. We got the Utah Warriors on bye. And I believe we also have Old Glory DC on bye. So those are those 4 teams that you will not be having any players from 4 teams that have some fantasy relevant players that are heavily relied upon. And that's why this waiver wire, I think, is going to be the most important waiver wire of the season so far, because you're going to need to look for value. You're going to need to look for points, and you're maybe not going to be able to get an explosive point performance, but you're going to need to at least find adequate points here. And that's how you're going to make it through this Bye-Mageddon stage through round 11 and 12.
And look, there are some teams in our league that need wins in the next 4 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got 2 weeks in a row of Bye-Mageddon, and you got to figure out how the heck you're going to cope with that. And you need points, like you said. I was thinking about it today. I thought, what makes this is what is going to tell me that, hey, I need to just take this loss at this position, because what can I do? I can't drop them because I need them next week.
Right.
I can't, I don't have space to pick anybody up. That's why it was something that I was saying last week. You got to plan for it the week in advance. So it'll be interesting to see what moves are made around the league. But yeah, this waiver wire is important. I got to agree.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. So let's hop into this waiver wire again. I think it's pretty slim pickings, and we'll get into the Bodine Waka and Ruben DeHaas and all those conversations in a little bit, because that's kind of more of a future output kind of look here. But let's talk about trying to make it through this Bye-Mageddon. So we're going to do this a little bit differently here. We're going to go position by position, because we know how important it is for these managers in terms of trying to find a little bit of value here. So let's start with the front row position. Anyone here on the front row that really pops out to you that you could plug into your lineup, and be confident in to at least get you some points here?
Yeah, I mean, for me, Jared Adams is a guy that I've talked about in previous weeks. I mean, he comes out last week with 8.5 fantasy points, and he comes out always explosive. Nola Gold's one of the teams that's not on bye this week. He could be a nice little stream for you, and that could look good. The other one that I brought him up earlier. If you don't need a front row this week, if you've already got your front row position solidified, look into the future. Vuga Koto is a guy that you can pick up. If they're on bye this week, they're not going to be on bye next week.
Right.
And he's a guy that you can
Good
plug
point.
in and look into the future and try to pick up a guy if you have space.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be interesting, because again, I want to reiterate, you're not necessarily trying to find matchup winners here. You're just trying to find guys that aren't going to lose you the matchup, that are at least going to get you, 4 to 7 points here to keep you in your round 11 matches, and those are both guys that I think can definitely do that. Let's shift over to the second row position now. This one's a tough one, because again, second row is not really a position that really produces much fantasy points to begin with, but there might be a couple guys that you see here.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, look, like you look at a guy that maybe you would want to pick up is Cam Dodson in Chicago, but they're on bye. What are you going to do?
Right.
I don't think you're going to take a risk of taking up that spot with a guy who's only played 1 week and had just one good week, because you never know. I'm looking at guys like Hamish Delzell. New York's having injury issues. He seems to be getting playing time, and he seems to be looking good. Another guy that I will look at as well is Isaac Ross. I mean, Isaac Ross has a good week 10. Yeah, they're facing the Houston SaberCats in this upcoming week, but that could mean for a high scoring game, and that may be good for him.
Absolutely. All right. Back row players. I think back row is where it gets a little bit more interesting, because I think there's always the opportunity for a back row player to be fantasy relevant, just because of their game style. They do a lot more of the tackling. They're around the ball a lot more. So who are guys that you're looking at here for this round 10 Bye-Mageddon?
Yeah, a guy I like is Malcolm May. I like the way that he's been playing for Nola Gold. He could come out really strong. He's gotten, 5.6, 4.2, 8.3 last week. Not great. But again, you're not looking for weak winners here. You're looking for guys that you can plug in and at least just get you some points. Another guy that, you got to kind of talk about is, and it's tough to talk about the Arrows, but they're playing this week. You got slim pickings. And Mitch Eady's a guy that somehow finds a way to, in games, be able to have some sort of offensive impact and have those explosive impact. They're playing the Nola Gold. It'll be a tough matchup, but we have seen Nola Gold kind of struggle sometimes. And the fact that Nola Gold's playing Toronto might be an even better reason to pick up Malcolm May as well.
Sure, and don't let Mitch Eady's fantasy point totals necessarily scare you too often. In the past 2 games, when he didn't really perform fantasy-wise, he didn't play over 40 minutes. One of obviously coming off the bench, but only playing 37 minutes in that round 7 matchup. This past week, again, 10.8 fantasy points, pretty good at that second row position, at the back row position for a guy that you're picking off the waiver wire 10 rounds into the season. I will say, I think a lot of fantasy managers will be looking at Nakai Penny just because he's available there. But I will say, you got to watch it. And they're facing the Jackals. I will say, will he be in that lineup? I'm almost 85% sure that he will be in that starting lineup. And if he is, I think he's an instant starter for you as a streamer. But keep an eye out. We did see Ronan Foley return this past week. Does that change things? Does Ronan Foley reclaim that starting position? I'm not too sure. We'll see, but definitely keep an eye on Nakai Penny. All right, let's shift on over now. I'm going to bunch these together because I don't think there's really anyone. I think we can mostly talk about just the lack thereof of these players. But scrum half, fly half positions, really, at this point of the season, and maybe this is something strategically wise that fantasy managers will carry with them towards, in future seasons is the importance to have scrum half and fly half depth at the start of the season. Because right now, when you look at what is available, it's really nothing. And if you don't have a scrum half or a fly half heading into this Bye-Mageddon, you're really not going to be able to do much with this position this week or next week, because it's slim pickings, and really there's no one that's going to jump off the board that's going to be able to produce for you fantasy wise.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's tough. Look, there's only 10 teams, but there's 12 teams in the league. You've got 10 fantasy managers. There's only 12 starting fly halves that you can really have. But and scrum halves essentially. And I'll bring up a few. Kirk Coleman may be something that's interesting just because I think Duncan Van Skolvik went off with a bit of a niggle or an injury. So we'll see there. Kirk Coleman has always been good stepping in. I also look at Shane O'Leary. I mean, he had a good game this past weekend. He's had a good couple games, I think. And he may be a guy that you just need to desperately slot in as a kicker, because the one thing that you're going to need and you're going to want is at least somebody kicking for you to get some of those kicking points. At the 9 position, I mean, that's a tough one. You might look at some of the, you might look at Ryan Reese, Rugby Atlanta. I think that he's going to continue to start for them. But that one's a tough one to look at. I think guys are kind of stacked up at that position too.
Now, I think the big question that fantasy managers will be asking themselves is, where do you draw the line in terms of dropping one of your guys that you have on your lineup that you may be a little bit hesitant to drop in order to pick up a 9 that isn't necessarily starting, but is going to get subbed in at maybe the 60-minute mark to at least get some sort of points or get an opportunity? Is that something worth it? I mean, you're looking at guys like John Lefebvre. You're looking at guys like maybe Nick Boyer. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. But your opinions on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so. I think at that point, you just take the loss in the scrum half position. And honestly, the scrum half position and maybe the front row position are 2 positions that you can afford to just not have anybody in if you really can't pick anybody up.
Sure. And it's similar, and we'll shift over now to the center conversation. You're similar to the back row conversation. Again, the center position kind of really lends itself to the fantasy MLR style of point scoring. So you're going to find a lot more guys here in this one who from the center position kind of pops out to you in terms of a guy that you can plug and play here to get you through this tough bye week.
I mean, we got to talk about Thomas Mulattos. I mean, their offense is looking better and better every week. Yes, they're playing the Seattle Seawolves, but I think that he could have another great week after that one. And honestly, I mean, Furman Martinez, we don't know if he's injured still. Threadon Palamo.
I believe Furman Martinez is out for the season with a knee injury.
Well, that stinks for my team. Guess I'm dropping him. But thanks for that news, Old Glory DC Insight. I mean, Brennan Palamo, then in that case, maybe he's a guy that you pick up this week if you have the space, just because I know some people may have more centers than they can carry. Maybe he's a guy that you pick up. But, you talk about how much depth there is at center, but, so many centers have probably already been picked up already. Because of their fantasy impact, that it's almost tough sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, last one here, back 3 position. This one, I think really you're approaching this as, who do you think is going to score a try this week? Who do you think is going to score a try? And do you take the approach from a matchup standpoint, or you're trying to pick a team that's taking on the Dallas Jackals? You're trying to find a Seattle Seawolves guy. Are you trying to find a Nola Gold guy who's taking on the Toronto Arrows? That's the big question here. But for you, who do you lean towards in terms of a back 3 player that you think is going to have a big impact in round?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to bring up 3 guys here. Veroneki Tika Solomone, that guy seems to score a try every game. I don't know how he does it, but he just continues to find a way to the try zone. Martin Iosefo, again, playing the Jackals. I think he could be an interesting pickup. I'm going to stretch it to 4 guys here. Dougie Fife against the Toronto Arrows. He had a good game. I mean, 10 points. He's kind of been sitting on our waiver wire all this time. It's been interesting to see, but I think he could definitely be a streamer. And then the last guy I'll bring up is Spencer Jones. I mean, Spencer Jones has been kind of going under the radar. They have a big game against the New York Ironworkers, or hurt New York Ironworkers, but Spencer Jones seems to have been able to find an impact in the past, 4 weeks.
Yeah, 3 straight starts for Spencer Jones in rounds 8, 9, and 10, and really hovering around that 10-point, double-digit point total. 9.6 in round 8, 10.8 in round 9, 12.7 in round 10. Some subtle improvements you do like to see. But again, It's Bye-Mageddon, man. It's going to be a tough one, and there are going to be some interesting
Yeah.
lineups that are being put out in this
And
one, and it comes at a very crucial time.
and look, I got to bring this up because if you have the ability and you see a desperate fantasy manager drop somebody that they shouldn't be dropping, do your due diligence, find a way to pick those guys up. If you can make an upgrade of somebody who decided they've thrown away, take advantage of that. Yeah, maybe it might not help you out this week, but there's a few more weeks where you could rack up some wins, and that guy could be huge for you. And another guy took a risk in dropping them just to get the win this week.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's just the next level type trying to of strategic heading into it. If you can afford to, or you have a solid lineup this week and you have someone that you can drop, yeah, definitely look at for those guys that are being dropped this next week, because there's gonna be a whole bunch of them. Because again,
Yeah.
it's not typical to see 4 out of the 12 teams here in Major League Rugby have a bye. And again, we have 10 teams in this Fantasy Ruckers League. Depth is definitely hard to come by on a regular week, and when there's 4 teams not playing, it comes even harder with that too.
Yeah.
So should be interesting. All right. Well, hey, let's talk about now, I guess, the whole Bodine Waka, Ruben Nahas, and those types of waiver wire situations, because that is kind of a good segue into the long term outlook, right? If you're one of these teams that are at the top of the Fantasy Ruckers League rankings, like yourself, Matt, I would even throw in, the guys that are sitting at that 6-4 record, a little bit dicier there, because not so much. That playoff race is definitely still close, but if you are confident with your team and where they're at, and you think the players that you have now can continue to get those wins, and you have the space to add a player like Bodine Waka, like Ruben DeHaas in the middle of the season who you think can have a big impact, I would honestly put Bodine Waka as that main conversation there, because we know what he did last season. What are you doing here? What type of weight are you putting on this? Again, the fantasy season, at least from a regular season standpoint, only goes to at the end of round 14. Will Bodine Waka even be back in time and be making significant impacts in this Fantasy Ruckers League during that span to help you with that push? Or are you really saving him for weeks 15, 16, 17 when it is the Fantasy MLR playoffs, when he is probably making an appearance at some point?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll start with Ruben Nahas. 9 position, let's not put too much weight into it. You don't have to put too much fab on him. You're gonna find production at the 9 position, whether it's him or other guys in the league. I don't think you need to go too heavy on him. When you're talking about Bodine Waka, I mean, so the rule in the MLR is you got to play 4 regular season games to be able to be eligible for the playoffs. So really, worst case scenario, they're not back until week 14. So they can play 14, 15, 16, or actually 15, 16, 17, 18. They play those 4 weeks. That's all they need. And, is that relevant for us? Is that, like, let's say they come back week 15, you're holding that roster spot for a long time. And unless you're willing to kind of put that aside and say, hey, I'm going to be 14 players that I'm going to be working with for my playoff push, I mean, that's a tough decision to make. Now, if you're in a position,
And I just want to say, that's assuming too that, let's say it's that timeline, that's assuming too that in week 15, which is our quarterfinal, right? You would assume that he needs to be in that lineup starting to be anywhat confident for you to play him out there. Does that happen? I can't imagine that happens. Not with the way that New England Free Jets have been playing.
And Jason Potros is still looking good, and maybe he slots in at 15, but is he still that reliable kicker? Is Jason Potros going to continue to kick? And I mean, I'll segue to the point of, like, the fantasy manager who owns Jason Potros and is sitting at 9-1 at the top, who maybe doesn't have as much need to get wins in there, or can afford to risk holding that position in the next 4 weeks, is maybe the guy that really should be picking up Bodine Waka, dropping the fab on him. And same thing. Yeah, same thing with the whole, like, 9 at Houston Sabercats. I got Carlo Denisian. Can I afford to pick up Ruben Haas? I don't know. Maybe. Do I need the wins for the rest of the week, the rest of the season? Who knows?
Aside, that is a good point, because it's all contextually based, right? The value that Bodine Waka has to the manager who owns Potros, or the value that Ruben Nahas has, the manager that owns Carlo Denisian, is way more way more, significantly more than any other team in the league. Even if you are hoping that, he can be interjected into your lineup and have some sort of fantasy implication for you in a playoff push.
Yeah.
It's a very risky game to be played. And especially if you're a team that has been fighting this way to get that playoff spot, for your season to be on the line and not trust the players that you got here with off of one off start from last year's player of the season. I don't know. It's hard for me because you'll be kicking yourself if you slot in Bodie Walker. He plays, let's say, 50 minutes, right, to just get his, legs going and stuff, and really doesn't do a crazy amount, and that costs you your fantasy season. That'll be a tough one. But nonetheless, you could be looking like a genius. You get Bodie Walker, and he ends up playing full 80 minutes and looks like Bodie Walker from last season, and that carries you all the way to the title. I mean, that could very well easily happen too. So just interesting notes to kind of approach this situation. Which will be interesting over the coming weeks, especially with how close the Fantasy Ruckers League playoff race really is. Again, just to remind our viewers and listeners, and again, you can check this out on thefantasyruckers.com. Outside of Matt, really, the playoff spots are right now decided between 2 wins. We got 3 teams with 4 wins, 2 teams with 5 wins, 3 teams with 6 wins. That cutoff being the 5-5 record right now. So it's really a nail biter between 9 of the 10 teams in our league right now. So again, I'm not sure how many teams in our league have the luxury to be able to take that risk at this point of the season. We'll see. All right. Well, let's look at this Bye-Mageddon and talk about these 4 matches that are being played in round 11 and give you guys some predictions and what we think from a fantasy perspective.
What the heck is this, Ryan?
It is tough. It is tough.
What is this weird scheduling?
We got a Thursday night matchup on
you
April 28th.
You have 4 games and you still can't figure out how to schedule them over 3 days?
We got a Thursday matchup, correct? Thursday? No, Friday matchup on April 28th between the Seattle Seawolves and Dallas Jackals at 10 o'clock Eastern time. Then we got 3 matches on Sunday, all overlapping at 3 and 4 o'clock.
What are you doing? Like, what are you doing? Like, what? How, why? Why? Why?
I mean, we've said it a
They're
million
all
times.
on the Rugby Network. How many logins do you think I can do? How many devices does the Rugby Network let me even log in on at once?
You're just gonna need to make four different accounts.
Let's go through them, Ryan.
All right, let's go through them. First matchup on Friday.
What am I gonna do on Saturday?
What are you gonna
at
do
least
on Saturday?
Watch a game, maybe, but the MLR said no.
Yeah. All right. Seattle Seawolves taking on the Dallas Jackals at home. I think this one's pretty straightforward. I mean, to be fair, it may not be as straightforward as we think it is because the Dallas Jackals did put up a whole bunch of points against the San Diego Legion. But I do think that the Seattle Seawolves are a little bit better defensively, I would think, than the San Diego Legion. And they are at home. I'll just put it out there. I'm picking Seattle in this one. I think the only fantasy advice that you need is that you're playing all your Seattle Seawolves players. And again, it's the typical Dallas Jackals guys that you got in your lineup. Sam Gola, Adrian Boyson, and you know what? I would even throw Conrad Aurora in there as well after coming off of a 18-plus point performance this week.
Yeah, I'm going to go with the Seattle Seawolves and Wells. I think it's going to be a high-scoring match, though. So,
do you?
Yeah, I think it's gonna be a high scoring match.
Would you be confident in your Dallas Jackals players this week then, especially considering Bye-Mageddon? Would you play some of these guys over maybe some of these flyers that you may take on different matchups on better teams?
Yeah, I would play my Dallas Jackals guys. I like the way their offense looks, and the way that they gave it to San Diego Legion. I thought showed a really good sign for them.
Okay, obviously, Thomas Milanos is one of the pickups of this week. You're putting him in your lineup, obviously, if you're picking him up. But just going through some of these Dallas Jackals players, I want to know where your cutoff is in terms of what guys you are and aren't playing in this one. It's considering that you're so confident in this one. Let's talk about, you're obviously, like we mentioned, Sam Gall is going in. Conrad Aurora is going in. Adrian Boyson is going in. You confident with Marcos Moroni in this one?
I'll play Marcos Moroni. I mean, he's got, last time he played in week 7, 7.3 fantasy points. It's still adequate for me to play in my lineup.
Okay. Are you playing someone like Campbell Johnstone or Alejandro Torres? I know those guys are probably free agents picking him up.
Campbell Johnstone, no. I'm not going to play him. That's a bit of a stretch. Alejandro Torres, I mean, we'll have to see whether he's actually going to be like what he's going to play in that lineup, especially with their new signing. So that'll be iffy too. I probably wouldn't play him either.
You confident with the last two here, considering scrum half and fly half are so thin. Martin Elias and Pedro Imhoff.
I mean, Martin Elias, you're going to have to play. I think he's a guy that you just, if you have Martin Elias, you're struggling at 10 position. So that's just your fault. And then Pedro Imhoff, I mean, again, it's a thin. If you have to play him, you have to play him. But I wouldn't necessarily. If I had an option, I would.
All right. Let's shift on over now to the next matchup on the Sunday. Nola Gold taking on Toronto Arrows at home. This is Toronto Arrows' first away match in quite a while here after having their home stint. So again, are we going to get their away Toronto Arrows squad that obviously has struggled in the earlier parts of the season? That might be something you need to consider when looking at your Toronto Arrows guys. But again, with this bye week, you may not have the luxury to do that. Regardless, I'm going Nola at home here in this one.
Yeah, Nola Gold at home. Toronto Arrows, they don't have to push being at home, and the goal mine is the goal mine. So Nola Gold to the chip.
All right. Are you confident in some of these Toronto Arrows guys that we mentioned? I mean, you talked about Mitch Eady. You're obviously playing Ross Brody because of the performance he guys and how thin's nine's at. But Ross Brody, would you look at some of these other guys because of the bye week in this one? Or are you really staying away from this matchup?
I would kind of stay away from them just because they're not at home. But guys like Shane O'Leary, who maybe you're going to have to pick up as your kicker, I would still be confident in those pickups.
All right, big Eastern Conference matchup here that's going to have a lot of implication. The New England Free Jacks taking on the New York Ironworkers at home. We'll see whether or not the New York Ironworkers can get back in form here. The New England Free Jacks obviously have been rolling. In this one, I think you're playing as many New England Free Jacks players as you can. I mean, LaRue Milan, Potros has been doing fantastic, just to name a few. It'll be interesting, but again, I think the New England Free Jacks come away with this one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually going to go with the New York Ironworkers. I think they're going to come out and with a big game this week. Yeah, I think they'll look good. I'm going to go with the New York Ironworkers here. I think this is going to be a bit of a defensive battle. So I don't know how this one's going to look for fantasy, but we'll see.
All right, and then shifting over to the last matchup of the Sunday, San Diego Legion taking on the Houston SaberCats at home in a battle of a top Western Conference teams right now, sitting 1 and 2. I'd probably the marquee matchup of the week. This one's gonna be interesting. Hard for me to bet against San Diego, though. I think I'm gonna go San Diego in this one.
Yeah, I'm gonna go San Diego Legions. This is gonna be a good one for fantasy, though. Lots of high scoring points. I would say you can play either one of your San Diego or Houston players. I think this is gonna be a good one for us.
Sweet. All right. Well, it looks like we're pretty much even there in terms of our picks outside the New England Free Jacks, New York Ironworkers one. Again, not really going to have the luxury of being able to sit a bunch of these guys because of the 4-team bye week. It's going to be interesting. These lineups are going to be interesting. But yeah, I think if you follow some of these tips and tricks that we've outlined in this show, you'll be able to navigate the next 2 weeks of this Bye-Mageddon. And if you can make it on the other side, I firmly believe this point in the season, and this is where we'll end the show. This is the 2 weeks that are going to have the most reliance on the skill of fantasy managers in the Fantasy Ruckers League. How do they approach this week? How do they approach this waiver wire? And at what lineup decisions do they make? And because of how close the Fantasy Ruckers League really is, whoever is able to navigate these next 2 weeks the best is going to be able to book their ticket into the playoffs after this 2 weeks, and is really going to have a leg advantage heading into the final 2 weeks of the Fantasy MLR season.
Yeah, seems pretty fair. I mean, I'm just looking for one win so I can clinch first place. So that's about all I need.
No worries there. The rest of the league is sweating. Rock and roll. Absolutely rolling and chilling, aren't you?
Yeah, sure am.
All right. Well, hey, again, if you aren't already, give us a follow, give us a like at the Fantasy Ruckers. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a like down below. Subscribe to the podcast. Love the support that we've been getting, through the entire MLR community. Again, we continue trying to expand this Fantasy MLR thing. People have reached out to me in terms of their interest in joining a Fantasy MLR league. We're hoping to provide that in the sometime near future. We're working to do that. And all of our social media channels, our Discord channel, thefantasyruckers.com. That's all going to be places where you'll be able to hear that first and be able to interact with Fantasy MLR as well. But yeah, enjoy Bye-Mageddon as best as you can. Focus on those games. Try to navigate through this week. It's going to be an interesting one. And we'll be back next week to break down and help you navigate through the second half of the Bye-Mageddon League. So for Matt, for Ryan, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. We'll be back in just
Bye-Mageddon.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.